Hello and welcome to Dollars and Cents, the Australia Institute podcast where we're talking about just what the hell is going on in the economy. I'm Elinor Johnston-Leek, the senior content producer here at the Australia Institute, and back again to sub in for Greg, because Greg is away. We have our senior economist, Matt Grudnoff. Hello, Matt.
Hello, Elinor.
Thanks for coming back.
Thanks for inviting me back. I feel so special to be substitute Greg.
I know. It's like, what, you got 2 weeks in the last 3 weeks? It's pretty good.
Yeah.
Yep. Slowly replacing.
Slinking in.
Yeah, one day.
Yeah,
it'll be Dollars and Cents with Matt Grudnoff.
And Elinor.
And wouldn't that be good? My name on the logo.
Of course. Well, that's how I'm going to get in, right?
You're getting me on your side.
Yeah, I'll get you on your side.
All right, very good. Well, Matt, today we are talking about inflation. We've got some new inflation figures out, apparently, which are the inflation figures for the month of February, which just happened, which already just feels like so long ago.
Yes.
I can't even really remember most of what happened, except that right at the very end, Trump declared war.
28th of February.
Yeah.
So these figures have absolutely
nothing to do
with the Iran. The fuel prices hadn't gone up at that point.
Yeah.
And so they are what inflation was before the world descended into madness again.
Yeah. So knowing that, I suppose now the inflation figures are going to be much worse. What were the inflation figures for February?
Well, they were down a bit.
Down a bit?
Yes,
That's
down
good.
a bit. They were 3.8% for the year the month before. They were down to 3.7%. The underlying inflation rate was basically steady at 3.3%, so a bit above the RBA's target of 2 to 3%, but generally heading in the right direction.
Oh, well, that's good and feels like unusual, I suppose, when we talk about inflation figures.
Certainly the RBA, because they increased interest rates, were clearly very concerned about inflation, but it seems that it wasn't rocketing up and that, things were slowly sort of drifting back down.
Yeah. Greg, and I assume probably some others here at the Institute, did some analysis that was on the point this week about the inflation in the last half of 2025 and what was actually driving that inflation. What did they find?
Let's go back to the middle of last year.
Yeah. Even longer ago. Yeah.
Inflation was actually running at 2%. So it was at the very bottom of the RBA's band. In fact, we had interest rates cuts on the back of this relatively low inflation. And things look to be improving. But then we've had in the second half of last year, we had prices spike back up. And what we've done at the Institute is we have basically tried to untangle what's driving that inflation. And broadly speaking, you can untangle it into, is it being driven by wages, which the RBA are always super concerned about?
They're always worried about.
Always worried about wages. and that must be, according to the RBA, the main driver of inflation. And the other thing that can drive inflation is profits, right? So if you imagine inflation is putting prices up, firms might be putting those prices up because their wage bill has gone up.
Yeah.
Or they could be putting their prices up and their profits are going up, as in their costs haven't increased or haven't increased by very much, and they put up their prices by a lot, and so their profits go up. And what we discovered is that in the second half of last year, this spike in inflation from about 2% to above 3% was entirely driven by profits.
That's insane.
Labor costs actually went down slightly.
Yeah.
So all of that extra inflation that came through is being driven by firms putting up their prices, not because their costs have gone up, but because they want to earn bigger profits.
And because I suppose if they're all doing it, if they all have an excuse to put up their prices, then they can raise, I suppose everyone just gets used to the idea of things costing more.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
But also they can do it. Like normally in economics, the thing that stops you from doing this is the fact that you're in a competitive market, right? If you've got lots of competitors, then if you put your price up, they're going to go, well, that was stupid of you. I'm going to keep my price the same and all your customers are going to come and shop with me and you're going to go broke. That's what stops you putting your price up. But Australia, not like that, right? Australia is full of, a lot of our industries are now full of what economists call oligopolies. A few big firms, right, that dominate the market, that have lots of market power. Think banking, think insurance, think supermarkets, airlines. like the list of industries is very long, unfortunately.
So there's just a few big names, you know, in supermarkets as Coles, Woolworths, and those are a few smaller players, but those are sort of the big two.
Exactly right. Yeah. And so Coles and Woolies don't have to worry about lots of small competitors who are going to swoop in and, cut their lunch and take their business if they put their prices up. They know they only have to worry about the other big competitor. And so long as they're kind of happy to both increase their prices regularly, what we get is inflation and bigger profits. And so what the problem in Australia is this lack of competition, and it's getting worse and worse. And we know that this first occurred after the invasion of Ukraine, when we saw that big increase in inflation. Initially, it was for a number of reasons, like supply chain issues after COVID, the war in Ukraine, but it was then made worse by this profit push inflation, this price gouging that we saw from big firms. Well, what's just happened recently that these figures don't cover?
Yeah.
We've just seen another big spike, right? Another cost, just like we did after Russia's invasion of Ukraine. If this is sustained, this might just be the beginning of some more profit gouging, or profit push inflation, I should say, as firms basically move in and say, well, this is a great time. People expect prices to go up. Everybody's talking about how prices are going to go up.
Yep.
Don't you know, Elinor, the prices are going to go up?
Fuel's so expensive, and that means everything's more expensive.
Everything needs to be transported. So when you rock up to the supermarket and prices have gone up 5 or 10%, you're going to shrug your shoulders, or most consumers are going to shrug their shoulders and go, well, that must be because of the fuel.
Yeah.
Well, maybe it only increased their costs by 1 or 2% and they've put it up by 10%. Consumers don't know that. And that's what firms are going to take advantage of. And the reason they can do that is because they don't have that competition to stop them doing that. And what we're going to see is bigger profits for firms at the expense for Australians. And worse than that, because inflation is going to be higher, we might face more interest rate increases and higher interest rates because of this. So not only do they get whacked because they have to pay more, these are consumers, but if they've got mortgages, they're getting whacked again.
Yeah, when it's not them that are actually driving the inflation.
This inflation is not being driven by them.
Yeah, I mean, from what I remember recently, Michelle Bullock's been talking about, consumer spending's out of control, and that's what's driving inflation. And so to think that it's actually just profits are driving a lot of inflation.
Yep.
Yeah.
It's profits that is driving this inflation, not wages.
Yeah. And we've seen recently that the government is trying to they say they're trying to crack down on petrol stations.
Have any fuel retailers in Australia been price gouging?
I know that Australians are suspicious about these price spikes that we're seeing at petrol stations around Australia. Obviously, the global oil price is playing out, but we want to make sure, and we will make sure, that people aren't being taken advantage of, and that's the role of the ACCC. We're giving them all of the powers, all of the funding, all of the penalties they need to do a terrific job surveilling the petrol market and punishing anyone who does the wrong thing.
Can you tell us a bit more about what they're doing there?
Yeah, so whenever the public has real concerns that prices are rapidly increasing and that firms might be taking advantage of the situation, the government, no matter who's in government, says, we've told the ACCC to go and watch and take a closer look. And businesses, be careful. We're watching you. Yep. The ACCC is watching you. This is all performative. This is all nonsense, right? And the reason it is because it is not illegal to price gouge. Let me say that again. It is not illegal to price gouge, right? Here's what the two things that are illegal. If businesses get together with their competitors, sit down and have a meeting and decide to fix the price at some level where they all agree they will charge this particular price, that's illegal. That's called price fixing. And if they lie and mislead their consumers, so if they say, if they increase their prices by more than their costs and then say, everybody, the only reason we have increased our prices is just because our costs have gone up. So that's a lie. That would be illegal. Everything else is legal.
Yeah.
If you look out the window and see your competitors starting putting up price and go, well, I'm going to do that again, completely legal.
Yeah.
If you hear on the news that, prices are going to go up and you think, well, now's a good time to put up my price, completely legal. And so what the government is doing is trying to reassure the public
that they're doing
there
something.
is something happening.
Yeah.
When in fact, nothing is going to happen. The ACCC doesn't have the power to stop firms from price gouging because price gouging is not illegal. And just this week, the government introduced new legislation to crack down on price gouging. That's what they announced.
Yeah.
What they were doing, were they giving the ACCC new powers? No. What they were doing was doubling the penalties for the existing price fixing and misleading advertising. They were doubling the penalties.
But not
doubling the penalties.
Yeah.
Is that good? Yeah,
sure.
Probably.
Yeah.
Is it going to change anything? Not at all.
Yeah.
The chances of you catching somebody price fixing, that is entering into a formal agreement, is A, really difficult, and two, most firms just won't do that. They'll just look out and go, well, I'll up my price and then he ups his price and then I'll up my price. And, so long as there's not a formal agreement, all of that is completely legal.
Yeah. I mean, petrol stations have their prices. It's pretty easy to see those prices.
Exactly right. Exactly right. And so, when you hear the government saying, oh, we've got the ACCC on it, what they're actually saying is, we know that you're concerned and we want to look like we're doing something.
Yeah.
Now, you might have heard a while back that there was talk about cracking down on price gouging and making price gouging illegal.
I think we've talked about this on the podcast before, yes.
But it wasn't for petrol retailers. In fact, it was only for supermarkets.
Yeah.
So if the government wanted to crack down on price gouging, they could. Right? They're doing it in another industry.
Yeah.
They've just chosen to just do it for supermarkets. Well, you might ask, well, if it's good enough for supermarkets, why not the rest of the economy? And that would be a great question, Elinor.
Yeah.
And one that
why is that?
The government should definitely answer.
Yeah.
But let's be very clear. When you hear the government say we're sending the ACCC to look at it, all they're saying is we understand that you're concerned. We're concerned too. Not concerned enough to do anything about it.
Concerned that you won't think that we're doing anything
We're
about
concerned that you're concerned.
That's so reassuring.
It is very reassuring.
All right. Well, let's move on to another topic. A topic at the moment which is sure to get people commenting in the comments section on all of the videos we post from this podcast onto social media. Always gets a big response. Population growth.
Yeah.
Yeah. Hot button issue at the moment. There's this widespread belief that Australia's population has kind of exploded over recent years. The government's let in too many people, and that's in particular why things are so bad in the housing market in Australia. Immigration's kind of become a bit of a thing to blame that on. So, Matt, you wrote a piece for The Point this week about population growth. You looked at the numbers. What did you find? Is it true that population growth is out of control at the moment?
The short answer is no. The ABS every quarter releases their estimates for how many people are resident in Australia, and they did that just recently. So I had a look at the latest figures. Now, population growth is usually pretty boring. It's pretty steady and not a lot happens. The one exception to that was COVID, right? If you look at the COVID pandemic and the growth rate in the population, it has completely messed it up. It was a massive. And the reason was, why? Because the borders were shut, right? Immigration, or migration, I should say, went to zero, right? Some people came back to Australia. A lot of people left Australia. And when the borders were shut, basically it came to a standstill. But then when the borders opened, a lot of those people, international students and people on visas who left, let's be clear, they left because we had shutdowns, so they couldn't work. And all of the support, you might remember the JobKeeper was basically where the government paid employers, businesses, the salary of workers, even if they weren't working. Well, that was only available to Australian citizens effectively. So if you were on these visas, you're an international student, you couldn't get that. And so businesses wouldn't hire them because they couldn't get any money from the government for them. So they left, which is,
fair enough.
Fair
Understandable.
enough.
Yeah.
But when the borders opened back up, right, a lot of them came back, right? International students came back, visa holders came back. And so what we saw was a huge spike in population growth. So we have these two distinct phases. The first, the big drop off, and then the huge spike. And what everybody is focused on is the huge spike, right? And look, to be clear, for a little while there, population and growth in Australia was extremely high. As all those people came back into Australia, the population grew at a rapid rate. But the real question is, does the spike, the bounce back, offset the dip?
Yeah.
Are they the same, or has something changed and people are right and the population has actually grown faster than it used to? Well, according to the ABS stats, the answer is no. They actually almost exactly offset each other.
Yeah.
And the way you can do that is if you take the growth rate of the population before the pandemic and then you project that forward. So effectively you say, well, let's assume the pandemic didn't happen and the population just continued to grow at that average growth rate. Where would we be today compared to where we actually are?
Yeah.
And the population would be ever so slightly lower. Such a small difference that it doesn't really matter. They're effectively the same. And that makes sense if you think about it. There's been no major change in our immigration laws. There's been no major change in anything apart from the pandemic, but any other change that would change any of our migration things. So it makes sense that once the kind of the pandemic kind of disruption worked its way through, that we would go back to those old growth rates. And that's exactly what we've seen. And just because I know I'm going to get the questions in the comments, what I am talking about is the estimated residential population. That is basically anybody who usually lives in Australia, regardless of their visa status, regardless of their nationality or citizenship, right? So if you live in Australia, you're included in these results. It does not include consular officials, so the couple of hundred people who work. I don't think
we need to worry about that. Yeah.
And it also doesn't include tourists, right? So if you're just here very temporarily going around seeing the sights and then you're leaving, obviously it's people who live here. But it doesn't matter whether you're a citizen or not, what your visa is. If you live in Australia, you're counted in these figures.
And you've also looked at comparing the growth rate of the Australian population to the, I suppose, growth in our housing supply. So the rate at which Australia is building houses, because, obviously the population growth argument is used a lot when it comes to housing. What do we see from those numbers?
Yeah, so over the last 10 years, so let's take a longer period so that we don't have that. So if you cherry pick, right, and just take when the population was booming after the bounce back, you can make the figures look very strange.
Yeah.
But let's take 10 years, which is a longer period of time, so it captures all of that. Over the last 10 years, the population has increased by 16%, which is a reasonable, pretty big increase in the population over 10 years. That means in order for us to have just kept up with the same number of houses per person, if you like, then we need to build or increase the number of homes by at least 16%. Over that same 10-year period, we actually increased by 19%. So dwellings are growing faster than the population. And that's why we say it's not a supply problem.
Yeah.
What is the problem? Well, it's demand. It's the capital gains tax discount. Investors are demanding more housing because they want to take advantage of that capital gains tax discount because it's so lucrative way of making money that they've basically entered the market, outbid first home buyers, and that's what's locking them out.
Yeah. But when we're talking about, people saying that there's been that population growth has exploded, immigration's too high, they might not necessarily just be talking about since the pandemic. That's not that long of a time ago. One might even say it's still happening. Can we go back further than the 2010s? Like, how does Australia's immigration compare now to, say, previous decades?
Yeah, so that's a great question, right? So some people think that the population was growing too quickly before the pandemic. And so what I've done in my calculations is I've assumed that if the population continued to grow in that pre-pandemic rate, if you thought that pre-pandemic rate was too high, then you're going to think that the population growth rate right now is too high.
Yeah.
If you were comfortable with that rate back then you will be comfortable today. If you were uncomfortable and you thought that the population was growing too fast, well, we've defaulted back because, again, we haven't changed any laws. We've defaulted back to that old growth rate.
What about pre-2010s? Do we have any, how do we compare to that?
Yeah, we can go back a lot further.
Yeah.
And look, the 2010s weren't particularly huge. They weren't particularly low either. They were kind of about average. The real population growth in Australia happened in the 1950s and 60s and into the 70s. There was that huge boom and things kind of eased off a little bit and then they've kind of grown back a bit, but certainly not at the same rates as they were back in the 50s, 60s and 70s. But, the population of Australia continues to grow.
Yeah.
And, some people are saying that things have changed really recently and that we've had this huge explosion and right now we have way too many people coming in.
And that's why the housing market
And that's why the housing market is stuffed.
Yeah.
That is not true, right? What we have done is reverted back to where it was before the pandemic.
Yeah. Now, Matt, we used to do on the podcast something that we would sort of call Tariff Corner right at the end. Yep. We haven't done it in a while. There have sort of been bigger things going on when it comes to international relations. So we haven't done Tariff Corner in a while. But today I think we can kind of do something maybe a bit more positive. We've got a free trade deal, free trade corner time.
After 8 years of negotiations, Australia and the European Union have signed a landmark trade deal.
There is something unique about the partnership between Europe and Australia. It has matured over time, steadily and consistently.
The Australia-European Free Trade Agreement will lower trade and investment barriers between Australia and the EU, a market of around 450 million people.
With a growing unpredictability and uncertainty worldwide, countries are longing for stability and predictability. And this is what the European Union is offering.
The EU and Australia have agreed to a new free trade deal after 8 years of negotiations.
Long negotiations.
Long time coming, yep. But, this seems positive in a world where tariffs have been sort of the hot button thing. We're now collaborating. How exciting. Matt, what were the main sort of points of this deal?
Yeah, look, I'm an economist and it's my job to say, no, that was shit. And
okay. Was it
look, no, it's not shit. That's the wrong word. What it is these things get enormous amounts of attention. They take years and years to negotiate. People put a lot of effort into them and they're basically pointless, useless, not going to make any real change at all.
Oh, well, that's disappointing.
Yeah, look, a free trade agreement is basically a list of how we're not going to do free trade. When you think about it, right? So a proper free trade agreement would be a single line that says there will be no restrictions on trade.
Yeah.
What a free trade agreement is all of the restrictions on trade that we both agree with.
There will be no restrictions except
for, and then
A, B, C, D,
let's have a thick, basically
8
thing that
years
you
of
could club things to death with.
Yeah.
Of all the reasons that we won't have trade, right? So that's the first thing. The second thing is we've signed lots of free trade agreements and, they haven't had any big impact. Will this one have an impact? A very tiny and minor one. Will there be some people that will be better off? Yes, maybe. Will there be some people who think that they're slightly worse off? Yes. Are they going to get upset? Yes. Politicians love to talk about free trade agreements, I think, because they get to stand up and say, we think free trade is important.
They get to have their photo shaking hands.
We fought hard for you. Look how long this negotiation took. The world is going to be so much better. Our economy is going to be so much better. Let's take a great example. Back 20 years ago, Australia signed a free trade agreement under the then Howard government. I'm sure, Elinor, you remember well the Howard government.
Yeah. Yeah, actually. I mean, until I was 12. Yes.
12, there you go.
Yep.
We signed the US-Australia Free Trade Agreement in 2004 and it came effect into 2005. So 20 years ago. And it's been around for so long and it was supposedly so big that lots of people have done studies on what the impact was. And before Trump came along and showed exactly the value of free trade agreements by completely ignoring it and putting tariffs on us anyway, before that happened, what it showed is basically there was no net gain in trade at all between Australia and the US. In fact, there was probably a slight drop-off in trade with other countries that wasn't compensated by trade with the US.
Yeah.
And the EU free trade agreement will impact us at the margins, but oh my God, it is going to get so much coverage that it does not deserve.
Yeah. I mean, I've seen apparently the meat industry, farmers are mad. The meat boys are mad.
The meat boys are mad, yeah. And why are they mad? Because they are able to export more meat to the EU. Let me say that again. They are mad because they are able to export more meat to the EU. Why are they mad? Well, because they wanted to be able to export even more meat.
Okay.
Right? So the amount of meat they can do export has increased, but they're annoyed that it hasn't increased enough. And look, there are some other groups that are also annoyed. The EU will now be able to export cheese into Australia.
But they weren't before?
Well, there were some restrictions on it, and some of those restrictions have been lightened. But the reality is Australia is a very, very open economy. And so we don't have many trade restrictions. And so we don't really have anything to give up, particularly to make these agreements. And we're also therefore not going to have a whole heap of people who are disadvantaged because we don't have many restrictions to begin with. And so really it's just about basically getting access to their agricultural markets. And look, they don't want to do that. We want them to do that. They're going to give a little bit. We're going to say they didn't give enough, or some industries in Australia are going to say they didn't give enough. Will it matter in the long run? Probably not.
Yeah. I did see that Australian winemakers are still allowed to call Prosecco made in Australia Prosecco. So that's something.
I mean, the big obstacle to this free trade agreement was the naming stuff. Feta, Prosecco, all of those kind of things where basically the EU was saying unless you make Feta in Greece, you can't call it Feta. Unless you make Prosecco in Italy, you can't call it Prosecco. We resisted that, obviously. And so the deal we've actually got right now, which feels kind of a little bit rushed, like it's more about security and sort of showing that we're close allies for other reasons, given what's happening in the world. We basically didn't give ground on that, and they didn't give ground on their agricultural barriers, which is why the meat boys are upset.
I know it's my fault, but I feel like we need to stop saying meat boys.
The meat industry.
Boys and girls.
The
meat boys and girls, yes. Even girls can be meat. Anyway, you know what?
Even girls can be meat boys.
We are all meat.
Let's call it the meat industry.
Let's call it there, Matt. I think that's probably enough for today.
Thank you very much for having me again.
Yeah, I'll see you next time. I guess that Greg's away.
Yeah, Greg is sick. Greg's away. Greg's on holidays.
Can always call on Matt.
I can't believe it's not Greg.
All right. Thank you, everyone, so much for listening. If you want to read more from Greg or Matt about population growth or inflation figures, you can go to The Point. There's a lot of interesting stuff on there at point.com.au. And if you want to read any more of our research about anything else, you can go to australiainstitute.org.au. Today's episode was recorded on Thursday, the 26th of March, and some things may have changed since recording. Music, as always, is from Blue Dot Sessions, and we'll see you all next week.
Bye.